Welcome to G-Man Gaming and Reviews. Alright, so this is going to be the very first, I suppose you could say, non-video game review. I've also got a written review of this, which I'm going to be using as a guide so I remember my points, but this will be like a verbal review of a brilliant podcast that I came across called the Decoding the Art of War podcast. Which is, I listened to it on Spotify, which is obviously a paid service, but it's actually also available in the iTunes podcast. It's on iTunes, and I think it's also available on the China Plus website. So it's literally called the China Plus podcast. China Plus, the URL is chinaplus.cri.cn. I'm pretty certain. Let me just double check that because I'm pretty sure Decoding Art of War. Yeah, it is. It's a chinaplus.cri.cn. I'm going to put the URL to this podcast on iTunes and the China Plus website where you can listen to it. Now, general strategy and military strategy and business strategy is a sort of a very, very fond interest of mine. And obviously, the art of war is like this book is quoted by so many people. My personal experience, I suppose, with applying the art of war is I used to do a martial arts called Bujinkan, which is a Japanese martial art that, at least the way that they teach it, was a combination of 6 samurai arts or jujutsu and 3 ninja arts. Now, ninjutsu, as it's known in Japan, this has been there's a guy by the name of what's his name? I'm just gonna find it. I'm just going to find the guy's name because it's kind of important. Anthony Cummins. I'm pretty sure is Anthony Cummins, right? So this guy apparently has done a lot of reviews. So I'm going off on a side tangent here, so I'll forget about it. But essentially, like, the way that the Japanese or the Bujinkan guys interpret it is that ninjutsu, which is the art of the ninja, is heavily based off the art of war. Okay. Now, most people will know what the Art of War podcast, what the Art of War is. Like, it's Sun Tzu's name is famous. But, and I've read the Art of War before. I've got my own copy of it at home on my bookshelf, including, it's it's abridged version, or it's annotated version. Sorry. So, with the Book of Lord Shang, which is another interesting book, which is more on governance than anything else. But a lot of people have read The Art of War. Okay, I've seen it quoted many, many times. There's so many YouTube videos on it, basically saying that, principles from The Art of War, and them referencing it. But I have to say that this podcast was an eye-opener, because obviously the podcast was written by someone who was a native Chinese speaker. Not that you have to be a native Chinese speaker to understand the art of war, but it's just, he provided a very, very interesting interpretation of the art of war that in some ways it's quite different to, I would say, my interpretation of it, or the Western interpretation of the art of war. If you listen to a lot of people who've read The Art of War, one of the big come-aways with it is that there's a chapter in The Art of War, I think it's chapter 2 or 3, that talks about deception. And so a lot of people have said that The Art of War is all about deception, right? And that's what Sun Tzu's Art of War is all about. And it isn't just like average people who've read it. There's a guy by the name of Michael Pillsbury who served as director of the Center on Chinese Strategy in the United States since 2004. So he's a well-known, like, I suppose, military thinker and strategist. He actually said at a point in his life that the Chinese were pretending to be weak in order to deceive the United States in terms of their military power. According to this podcast, Michael Pillsbury heavily misunderstood The Art of War. That when Sun Tzu was saying that The Art of War was about deception, he wasn't saying that that's all it's about, and that deception alone can win a war, right? He wasn't saying that at all. Based on what the podcast said, that the purpose of deception is to disguise your strategy. Because according to Sun Tzu, the number one way to diffuse an enemy's morale, I guess, you know, when you're fighting against an enemy and you've got a strategy, is to diffuse their strategy. If you can diffuse their strategy, according to Sun Tzu, they will lose the morale to fight. Okay, the next best option after that is a diplomatic option, right? Like winning a war without having to wage it, right? One of the things that's very, very interesting about Sun Tzu's Art of War that I'm not sure that I understood was there's a saying in The Art of War. There's a saying in The Art of War that I'm not sure if it was the podcast was paraphrasing, but what it was saying was if a military strategist has won 100 battles, he's not actually a good strategist, because a good strategist wouldn't have had to fought 100 battles in the first place. So the thing that I found very interesting about this podcast was, obviously it's covering a topic that has been covered by a lot of people, but it covered it in a way that was quite unique that I haven't come across before. And if Michael Pillsbury can make a mistake about The Art of War, then literally every other Westerner could, or at least every other non-Chinese person, right? So I'm going to go into some interesting parts about that were specific to the podcast. That make it, one, this podcast is free, so you don't have to pay anything to listen to it. I listen to it on Spotify, which you have to pay to get, but you don't have to. You can get it on iTunes, you know, so you don't have to pay for it. But it was like the podcast was like 8 to 10 minute episodes on. One episode on each chapter plus some context, right? And one of the interesting things about the podcast that it talked about the context upon which Sun Tzu's Art of War was written was at the time that when Sun Tzu was alive, and I think they called it the Warring States period. I think that's what it was, maybe something like that. They were like you had the emperor, but then you had all these vassal states that were under him that were looking after things, and so they would disagree and they would fight. But the difference between the context was the way that a lot of people, obviously Sun Tzu didn't invent military strategy, and there were strategists before him. But one of the things that separated him was he viewed war as a strategic way, whereas a lot of the nobility regarded it as a sport. Okay, like the way that they would do things would be a military strategist a general would set up his troops in formation, right? And if that formation was busted by the enemy, was destroyed by the enemy, the general would just give up and say, "Yep, call it a day. You've beaten us," right? So that was how war was regarded in that context at that time by the nobility, right? So there's a lot more to Sun Tzu's Art of War than deception. Was way more to it than that. It's not a very big book, and which is why the episodes on this podcast are actually quite small. But I'll give you some specific examples of why this podcast was really, really good. So I think it's episode 1 or 2. There was this emperor. There was this I suppose you could say, I think it was a king who had taken over a state via regicide. So he killed his father, right? And so he was looking for a military victory in order to solidify his rulership, right? Because obviously people would have been annoyed that he killed his king, right? So he was looking for like a military victory to solidify his leadership, right? So he decided to go to war with a state, right? Another state, right? And I don't remember the exact names of the states, but you can listen to the podcast for that. But the general idea is very interesting. So he got the alliance of another 2 states, right? Which were added because they were seen as being heavily associated with the emperor, so it would give legitimacy to his fight against that enemy. He bribed another king of an area or a vassal state to get his army to come in. And then there was one more guy who this king that the enemy wanted to fight. He was housing what they call like a potential ruler to one of these other states, like a family member who was in the lineage to be. So, long story short is the story goes is that it then shifts to the perspective of the enemy, right there, and these 5 states have gone to this enemy, standing outside the borders, standing outside the. I suppose you could call it the city-state of the capital of this particular city-state, right? And the strategists for who we will call the enemy, they couldn't agree on a strategy to deal with this situation, right? So what they did was, the king actually he lays it out, and so he basically reveals that really. There was only he ruled out what each of them wanted, why they were in the battle in the first place. So he ruled out that the king who initially started the war, that he was looking for a quick victory to solidify his rulership, right? And then there were another 2 that were there, but they weren't really enemies of the so-called enemy. So they weren't really going to get into any serious fighting. So they could be ruled out, right? And then there was... and so basically this enemy managed to figure out there was really only one person there. There was really only one ruler there who actually wanted blood. And that was the ruler of the state of the state that wanted to kill that cousin that was a potential threat to the lineage, that was being housed by the so-called enemy. So what he did was, he grabbed that cousin who was being housed by the state, and he moved him to a different to a town, and then he sent a messenger out to tell that ruler that that your cousin is not at this town anymore. So then he left. He had no reason to fight against this enemy anymore, so he left, right? The other 2 left because they saw that the other person left, and then now there was only left was the king, right? And so what he did was, he actually sent out a general, the enemy, to duel a general of the king. He feigned defeat, so the enemy general feigned defeat, so that the king got his victory, and they looted some of the little, you could say, crops that were outlying the state, and they left. And so basically this gave an example of Sun Tzu's thinking, that rather than trying to destroy the enemy, figuring out the motivations for why that enemy is there, and then coming up with ways of diffusing that strategy. So basically, by that general feigning defeat in a duel, he gave the king the victory that he wanted, and so the king left without there being any serious battle. And by moving the cousin to another town, but not telling him where, but telling him he had left, now that ruler left as well, because he had no reason to be there anymore. So it just illustrates, like, this wasn't by Sun Tzu, but it just illustrates his way of thinking. Like, not just analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of the enemy, but also analyzing their reasons for being there. So I thought that was a brilliant example of, why this podcast is so good and why I really, really love it and why I'm listening to it for the second time. The other thing that was interesting was, which I don't think I ever gleaned from reading the book as well, was that Sun Tzu's strategy mainly persisted around two things: strong defense combined with flexible tactics. And in it, he talks about the concepts of Ji and Zheng. Obviously, I'm not Chinese, so I'm probably not pronouncing it. Ji is Ji, and Zheng is Zheng. So Zheng, as to my understanding, refers to the mundane, like your number of your main, or the main body of your army. Okay, I suppose that could be regarded as a solid defense, but essentially it refers to things that are not extraordinary. And then you have an example of the Ji, which refers to the extraordinary. And according to Sun Tzu, it's the combination of these two things that create strategy. So an example of Zheng would be your main body of forces, and the example of Ji would be special forces, a smaller force operating behind enemy lines using flexible tactics. So he actually gives one example in the book where these two forces were fighting against each other, right? And they were at a stalemate, right? And so what they did was they spread rumors in the enemy's court that the enemy general was the problem. And so the enemy general was removed by the king of the enemy, by the enemy's king, in order to replace him with a less experienced general. And at the same time, after that general had been replaced, the Zheng, which is the main body of forces, feigned retreat, and then the special forces had been sent to attack the enemy from behind to cut off their supply lines, and they won the war. So the special forces and the example of attacking the supply lines was an example of Ji, as well as the use of spreading rumors to get rid of an experienced general, to have him replaced with an inexperienced general, so he could feign the tactic of retreat to get them to cut off. So that's another example that was put in this book, in this podcast, which I think I really, really like, because the podcast is I'm pretty sure that Sun Tzu's Art of War, it doesn't really give you examples. I mean, you can find, but it doesn't really, like, the Sun Tzu's Art of War, if I've read it, I think the actual default version, it doesn't really give you examples of how to use things. So I think the really, really interesting thing about this podcast was the examples of how to use things, of how to use these strategies by Sun Tzu, provide a context for why why thinking the way that he does is actually really, really good. That just winning wars is not the actual way of strategy, of Sun Tzu's art of strategy. So this was a review of the podcast Decoding the Art of War, which I will post the link to in the YouTube video that I do, which will have some me playing a video game in the background. But yeah, definitely if you're interested in strategy, because the reason I started looking into this is because I was looking up. I'm trying to get good at playing. Whatchamacallit. Command and Conquer, the General series, and Red Alert, and I'm not that good at it. It's like a real-time strategy. I'm not the best at real-time strategy games. I'm more better at turn-based strategy games. But it's like this guy, Sun Tzu's Art of War, was being quoted in the guide on GameFAQs. So I was like, oh, I better go back to this. So I started looking at podcasts, and Decoding the Art of War came up. It's a brilliant podcast. I'll definitely link to it. I think you should also check out my written review of it. But yeah, this is a brilliant podcast. This was G-Man Gaming and Reviews, and please subscribe and like, and thanks for listening or watching. All right, both. All right, bye.